Doctrine is explicit, is hammered into every recruit from the first day of basic training through endless repetition by sergeants who've seen what happens when soldiers forget. Stay low, use cover, minimize exposure, survive through discipline and adherence to proven tactics. But on February 1, 1944, on a shallow agricultural rise near Cisterna di Latina in the Anzio beachhead where American forces had been pinned for weeks in what was supposed to be a bold flanking operation but had devolved into a grinding stalemate, Private First Class Alton Warren Knappenberger of Company C, 30th Infantry Regiment, 3rd Infantry Division, looked at the tactical situation unfolding around him and understood with sudden clarity that doctrine was going to get everyone killed, that the rules designed to keep soldiers alive were in the specific circumstance ensuring their deaths, and he made a decision that violated every principle of infantry combat. He stood up, moved deliberately toward the highest point on the battlefield. A 3-meter knoll that offered no cover, no concealment, nothing but absolute exposure to 3 German MG42 positions that had his platoon pinned and bleeding. And he did this not from panic or desperation but from calculated understanding that sometimes the only way to survive is to make yourself the most obvious target on the field, to force the enemy to reveal themselves by drawing their fire, to turn yourself into bait that creates opportunities for everyone else. The German machine guns responded immediately. The distinctive rapid-fire bursts of the MG42, nicknamed Hitler's Zipper, for its 1,200 rounds per minute cyclic rate that created a sound like tearing fabric, a sound that induced psychological terror even before bullets found targets. Stitching patterns across the ground around Knappenberger, kicking up dirt in geysers that jumped like water, creating that peculiar visual effect where supersonic rounds impact soil and send particles flying in directions that seemed to defy physics, and American officers who could see what he was doing screamed for him to get down. Screamed orders that couldn't be heard over gunfire and explosions, screamed in the helpless rage that comes from watching a soldier do something that appears suicidal, but Knappenberger stayed standing, stayed on that knoll where visibility was perfect in all directions, where he could see German positions that were invisible from ground level, where elevation gave him the geometric advantage that hunting white-tailed deer in Pennsylvania forests had taught him to recognize and exploit, that height breaks concealment, that what's hidden from one angle becomes visible from another, that the hunter who positions himself above the game sees what ground-level observers miss. Knappenberger had grown up in rural Pennsylvania where hunting wasn't sport but necessity, where families ate what they shot and understood that wasting ammunition meant going hungry, where he'd learned to construct elevated stands in trees because deer that couldn't be seen from the ground became visible from 10 feet up, where patience and positioning mattered more than firepower, where his brain had been trained by practical experience to think in terms of sight lines and angles and the relationship between elevation and visibility, and this education, entirely informal, never written in any manual, passed down through generations of rural Americans who understood terrain instinctively, now expressed itself on an Italian battlefield where formal military training was proving inadequate. He'd been drafted in 1943, had moved through the standard infantry pipeline that turned civilians into soldiers through repetitive training that emphasized following orders and executing proven tactics, had shipped to Italy as a replacement in a division that had already fought through North Africa and Sicily, and had learned the hard lessons of combat against German forces who were tactically sophisticated and brutally effective, and he'd absorbed the official doctrine but had never quite internalized the idea that manuals contained all possible solutions, had retained that rural pragmatism that said sometimes you had to improvise, had to trust what the ground was telling you over what regulations prescribed. The Anzio beachhead in early 1944 was a case study in operational ambition meeting tactical reality. Operation Shingle had been conceived as a bold amphibious end run around German defensive lines, a landing behind enemy positions that would force withdrawal and open the road to Rome, but the execution had been cautious where it needed to be aggressive, had consolidated the beachhead instead of pushing inland, had given German forces time to react and reinforce, and by February the situation had reversed. Americans who were supposed to be threatening German rear areas were instead defending a shallow perimeter against counterattacks that came with methodical precision and overwhelming firepower. The terrain around Cisterna di Latina was agricultural flatland broken by drainage ditches and occasional shallow rises. Terrain that favored defenders with good observation and prepared positions. Terrain where machine guns positioned in depth could create overlapping fields of fire that made movement suicidal, and German doctrine exploited this perfectly. Panzergrenadier units supported by MG42 crews established positions that covered every approach, created kill zones where American infantry Advancing by the book would be cut down before they could close to effective range. And this is exactly what was happening to Knappenberger's platoon when the German counterattack rolled in under morning fog that provided concealment until it suddenly lifted and exposed American positions that were out of supporting distance from their company, that were effectively isolated on terrain that offered minimal cover, that were under fire from multiple directions with casualties mounting and ammunition dwindling. The weapons problem was fundamental. American infantry doctrine centered on the M1 Garand rifle. An excellent weapon, semi-automatic, 8-round N-block clips, accurate and reliable, supported by Browning automatic rifles that provided squad-level automatic fire, but the bar was never meant to be a true machine gun, was too heavy to be a rifle and too light to match dedicated machine guns, fired from 20-round magazines that emptied in seconds of sustained fire, required frequent reloading, that created gaps in suppression, and most critically couldn't match the psychological and practical dominance of the MG42, which could sustain fire rates that kept enemy heads down, that created acoustic signatures that were terrifying regardless of whether rounds were hitting near targets, that were belt-fed and could maintain suppression indefinitely as long as ammunition and barrel changes allowed. When German MG42 teams engaged American infantry, the doctrinal response was to seek cover and return fire, to use fire and movement where some elements provided covering fire while others advanced. But this doctrine assumed rough parity in suppressive capability, assumed that American squads could generate enough outgoing fire to allow movement, and against multiple MG42 positions this assumption failed because the German guns could keep everyone pinned simultaneously, could create situations where movement meant death and staying still meant slow attrition from indirect fire and flanking maneuvers. Knappenberger's platoon was experiencing exactly this failure. They were pinned in shallow depressions that provided minimal protection, were taking casualties from German fire that they couldn't effectively return because they couldn't see enemy positions clearly enough to engage them, were running low on ammunition because they'd been firing blindly at muzzle flashes and suspected positions without achieving suppression, and the tactical geometry was collapsing toward a point where the platoon would either be overrun or forced to withdraw under conditions that would maximize casualties. The officers present understood this but had no solution within doctrinal parameters. They couldn't call for artillery support because friendly forces were too close, couldn't withdraw without exposing themselves to devastating enfilade fire, couldn't advance because the German positions were too strong, and they were trapped in that terrible situation where every option was bad and hesitation meant the situation would deteriorate further before any decision could be implemented. The knoll that Knappenberger identified was barely 3 meters above the surrounding terrain. Not a hill, not even a proper rise, just a slight swell in agricultural land that most tactical assessments would dismiss as insignificant. But from Knappenberger's position at ground level it represented the highest point in the immediate sector, and his hunting-trained brain recognized what this meant. Elevation would break the concealment that German positions relied on, would create sight lines that revealed what was hidden from ground level, would allow him to see not just muzzle flashes but actual enemy positions, would let him identify where German gunners were dug in and how they were positioned. The tactical geometry was clear once he understood it. 3 German MG42 positions established in a rough arc covering approximately 180 degrees, positioned at ranges he estimated as roughly 85, 100, and 120 yards based on visual assessment and the timing between muzzle flash and sound arrival, and these positions were mutually supporting, were placed so each could cover the other's blind spots, were dug in with overhead cover that made them nearly impervious to small arms fire from ground level. But from elevation, from that 3-meter knoll, the geometry changed. The overhead cover that protected German crews from ground-level fire would be less effective against fire coming from above. The sight lines would reveal parts of positions that were hidden from horizontal perspectives, and most critically, German gunners who thought they were concealed would be forced to expose themselves to return fire at a target on elevated ground. This is where Knappenberger's logic transcended conventional tactical thinking and entered territory that doctrine couldn't anticipate. He wasn't planning to suppress German positions through superior firepower, wasn't trying to destroy them through accurate fire, was instead planning to make himself such an obvious and threatening target that German crews would have to engage him, would have to shift fire to deal with the elevated threat, and in doing so would expose themselves to fire from American positions at ground level, would break their own concealment in attempting to eliminate him. It was controlled exposure, not suicide but calculated risk based on understanding that sometimes the most dangerous position is also the most tactically valuable, that visibility works both ways, that being seen can be an advantage if it forces the enemy into disadvantageous responses. When Knappenberger stood on that knoll and German machine guns pivoted to engage him, he was carrying a Browning automatic rifle, 20 pounds of steel and wood that was designed to be fired from prone or supported positions, that had significant recoil and was difficult to control in sustained fire, that held only 20 rounds and required careful magazine management, and he was about to use it in a way that bar training never contemplated. Standing fully exposed, firing aimed shots at German positions that were now revealing themselves by shooting at him, working through magazines methodically while bullets kicked up dirt around him and officers continued screaming for him to get down. The first German MG42 team to fully expose themselves in attempting to engage Knappenberger died within seconds. The gunner rose slightly to adjust his traverse, presented a target that Knappenberger could see clearly from his elevated position, took multiple .30-06 rounds that ended the threat from that position permanently, and the assistant gunner who moved to take over the weapon made the same mistake and met the same fate, and suddenly one of the 3 German positions was silent, one arc of the kill zone was open, and American soldiers who'd been pinned were able to move, were able to shift positions and apply pressure to the remaining German positions. But 2 MG42 teams remained and they concentrated fire on Knappenberger with the methodical professionalism that characterized German defensive tactics. They didn't panic, didn't waste ammunition spraying his general area, instead called corrections to each other and began walking fire toward his position with the understanding that sustained accurate fire would eventually hit even if initial bursts missed. Knappenberger responded by shifting position on the knoll, not leaving it, not abandoning the elevation advantage, but moving laterally to prevent German gunners from zeroing in, firing at every German position he could identify, managing his ammunition with the discipline of a hunter who'd been taught that every round mattered, and when his bar magazines ran empty he did something that wasn't in any manual. He crawled off the knoll under fire, recovered ammunition from dead and wounded American soldiers who no longer needed it, improvised reloading by breaking down M1 Garand N-block clips and manually loading individual .30-06 rounds into bar magazines, and then returned to the knoll and resumed firing because the tactical logic that had put him there remained valid. Elevation still provided visibility, German positions still needed to be suppressed, and abandoning the position would return the platoon to the hopeless geometry that had been killing them before he stood up. The engagement lasted approximately 2 hours, 120 minutes that became a grinding test of ammunition management, physical endurance, and psychological resilience, and during this period Knappenberger maintained his exposed position despite being under continuous fire from automatic weapons operated by soldiers who were trained and competent and increasingly desperate to eliminate the threat he represented. His bar overheated from sustained fire, burned his hands when he needed to perform field maintenance, developed malfunctions that he cleared through procedures that had been drilled into him during training but which were supposed to be performed in covered positions, not standing on a knoll while machine guns fired at him, and he experienced the progressive physical deterioration that comes from combat stress, hearing damage from repeated firing without protection, visual distortions from adrenaline and exhaustion, fine motor control degradation that made reloading harder, dehydration and energy depletion that his body compensated for through mechanisms he couldn't consciously control but which would extract their price later. German assaults that should have overrun the American position broke down because MG42 crews that should have been providing covering fire were instead focused on the elevated threat. Because German infantry advancing across open ground found themselves taking fire from American positions that should have been suppressed. Because the tactical coordination that made German counterattack so effective was disrupted by a single soldier who'd violated doctrine and forced the enemy to respond to an unanticipated threat. Bodies accumulated near German gun positions. Not the heroic charges of propaganda but the grim arithmetic of tactical geometry where soldiers exposed to effective fire from unexpected angles died before they could adapt, where the mutual support that made German defensive positions so effective became irrelevant when those positions were revealed and engaged, where training and equipment couldn't compensate for fundamental geometric disadvantage. The second German MG42 position fell when its crew attempted to shift positions under fire and was caught in the open by multiple American soldiers who could finally see and engage them, and the third position, the most distant, approximately 120 yards from Knappenberger's knoll, eventually ceased fire not because it was destroyed but because its crew recognized the position was no longer tenable, that remaining meant certain death, and withdrew under conditions that suggested unit cohesion breaking down, that suggested German forces recognizing that this particular counterattack had failed. The silence when the last machine gun stopped firing was profound and disorienting. Soldiers who'd been under continuous fire for hours struggled to process that the firing had stopped, that the acoustic assault had ended, that they could move without being shot, and gradually American soldiers began to rise from positions they'd occupied since the engagement began to assess casualties and redistribute ammunition and establish perimeter security, began the routine tasks that follow combat, and provide psychological structure when the immediate threat ends but the nervous system remains primed for danger. Knappenberger climbed down from the knoll with hands that were burned and bleeding, with hearing so damaged that voices sounded muffled and distant, with the physical and emotional exhaustion that comes from sustaining maximum stress for extended periods. And he didn't celebrate or make pronouncements about what had happened, simply found a position where he could observe his assigned sector and began the process of recovering physiologically from what he'd just experienced. Officers who'd screamed at him to get down now struggled with what to report. A private had deliberately violated fundamental tactical doctrine, had placed himself in a position that should have resulted in his death, had succeeded through methods that couldn't be easily replicated or taught, had saved the platoon but had done so through actions that, if officially endorsed, would encourage other soldiers to take similar risks that might not succeed. The immediate tactical aftermath was clear. The German counterattack in this sector had been stopped, the American position had been held, casualties that would have occurred if the platoon had been overrun or forced to withdraw had been prevented, and the beachhead perimeter remained intact at a point where its collapse would have had operational implications. Intelligence officers who conducted post-battle assessment counted German casualties near the 3 MG42 positions and in the approaches where assaulting infantry had been caught in the open. Over 50 enemy soldiers killed or wounded, 3 machine gun positions destroyed, a company-level assault broken, and these were verifiable results that couldn't be explained through conventional tactics, that required acknowledging that something outside doctrine had occurred. The official recognition came through channels that moved slowly even by wartime standards. Witness statements were collected, after-action reports were compiled, recommendations were made and reviewed and approved through multiple command levels until eventually Major General Lucian Truscott, commanding the 3rd Infantry Division, authorized the Medal of Honor for Private First Class Alton Warren Knappenberger for actions on February 1, 1944, near Cisterna di Latina, Italy. The official citation used language that conveyed facts while sanitizing the doctrinal violation at the heart of the action, described how Knappenberger had voluntarily moved to an exposed position and remained under heavy fire for 2 hours and inflicted severe casualties on the enemy, described results without fully explaining the logic that had produced those results, without acknowledging that what Knappenberger had done was precisely what infantry training taught soldiers not to do. The medal itself, America's highest military decoration, awarded for valor above and beyond the call of duty, became part of Knappenberger's official record, became a historical fact that would appear in division histories and Medal of Honor rosters, but the tactical lesson embedded in his actions remained ambiguous and difficult to codify. You couldn't teach soldiers to stand in the open and draw fire, couldn't make doctrine out of controlled exposure, couldn't systematize the kind of terrain, reading and geometric intuition that had allowed Knappenberger to recognize that elevation would break enemy concealment, because teaching this would encourage soldiers to take similar risks in situations where the tactical geometry didn't favor them, where exposure would simply result in casualties without achieving tactical effects. Military institutions are fundamentally conservative about tactical innovation at the individual level because the same initiative that produces extraordinary success in one circumstance produces catastrophic failure in another, because doctrine exists precisely to prevent soldiers from making individual judgments that might be brilliant or might be suicidal, and distinguishing between the two often requires context and understanding that can't be captured in training manuals. The broader implications of Knappenberger's actions at Anzio extend beyond the immediate tactical success. His decision demonstrated that warfare at the smallest scale, individual soldiers making split-second judgments about risk and geometry and enemy behavior, operates according to logic that formal doctrine struggles to capture, that sometimes the ground itself provides answers that training hasn't anticipated, that visibility and exposure exist on a spectrum where the conventional wisdom that concealment equals survival doesn't always apply. The fundamental insight that elevation could break enemy concealment wasn't taught in infantry schools, wasn't part of bar training, wasn't in field manuals about small unit tactics, but it was instinctive knowledge for someone whose pre-war experience had involved hunting from elevated positions, whose brain had been trained to think about sight lines and angles, whose understanding of terrain came from practical experience rather than theoretical study. Modern military education has attempted to systematize this kind of tactical intuition, has developed training that emphasizes terrain analysis and cover versus concealment and geometric relationships in small unit combat. But there remains an irreducible element of individual judgment that can't be taught, can only be developed through experience and manifested by soldiers who possess both the tactical understanding to recognize opportunities and the courage to exploit them when exploitation requires violating established procedures. Knappenberger's legacy is visible in small unit tactics that emphasize dominating key terrain even when that terrain is exposed, in the understanding that suppression depends on visibility and that being seen can force enemy responses that create opportunities, in the recognition that doctrine provides baseline guidance but that battlefield success often requires exceeding or violating that baseline in ways that can't be pre-authorized because they depend on context that only the soldier on the ground can assess. The philosophical tension at the heart of Knappenberger's story is the relationship between individual initiative and institutional authority. Military organizations require obedience and standardization to function at scale, require that soldiers follow orders and execute doctrine even when they disagree, require suppression of individual judgment in favor of collective coordination, because without this discipline armies dissolve into armed mobs where everyone does what seems right in their own eyes and chaos results. But warfare is ultimately conducted by individuals in specific places making specific decisions based on local conditions that distant commanders can't observe and general doctrine can't anticipate. And victory often depends on soldiers who recognize when doctrine doesn't fit circumstances, who possess the judgment to deviate from established procedures, who accept responsibility for making decisions that might result in their deaths or court-martial but which seem necessary in the moment. Knappenberger stood on that knoll not because he was reckless or because he misunderstood infantry tactics but because he understood that staying low meant slow death, that cover without visibility meant his platoon would be destroyed, that the only tactical option that might work required making himself a target, and he made this assessment based on immediate observation of terrain and enemy positions in friendly situation, made it in seconds without consulting officers or referencing manuals, made it and executed it and sustained it for 2 hours while people tried to kill him, and succeeded not despite violating doctrine but because he violated doctrine at precisely the moment when doctrine no longer served its purpose of keeping soldiers alive. The lesson isn't that doctrine should be ignored or that individual soldiers should make unilateral tactical decisions. The lesson is that doctrine is written for averages and war is fought by individuals, that rules that work 99 times fail catastrophically the 100th time, that the soldier who recognizes that 100th time and adapts accordingly is worth more than the 99 who followed rules in situations where rules worked, and that military institutions must somehow accommodate both the discipline that makes armies effective and the initiative that makes soldiers survive situations where discipline alone is insufficient. When Knappenberger returned to civilian life after the war, after Italy and southern France and Germany, after campaigns whose names would be written in history books and battles whose details would fade from public memory, he didn't speak much about Anzio or about the 2 hours on the knoll or about the decision to stand when everyone else stayed down, returned to Pennsylvania and to a life where the skills that had saved his life in Italy had no direct application but where the underlying instinct that terrain tells truth and that sometimes safety requires risk remained part of his character. The Medal of Honor became a historical fact, appeared in his obituary when he died decades later, marked him as one of the relatively few soldiers whose actions were deemed worthy of the nation's highest recognition. But the medal itself was less important than what it represented. A moment when an individual soldier's reading of tactical geometry proved superior to collective doctrine, when staying alive required violating the rules designed to keep soldiers alive, when courage manifested not as charging enemy positions in the face of certain death, but as standing in the open drawing fire because standing created the geometric and psychological conditions that made survival possible. The fact that this story remains obscure even among military historians, that Knappenberger's name doesn't appear in popular histories of World War II, that his tactical innovation wasn't widely adopted or taught, suggests that institutions struggle to learn from successes that can't be systematized, from victories that depend on individual judgment rather than collective procedure, from examples that demonstrate the limits of doctrine rather than its effectiveness. The ground told Knappenberger the truth that February morning near Cisterna di Latina, told him that elevation breaks concealment, that visibility can be armor, that doctrine's rule to stay low was in this specific circumstance a prescription for death, and he listened to the ground rather than to training, trusted immediate observation over institutional authority, made a decision that should have killed him but instead saved everyone around him, and in doing so demonstrated that warfare's deepest truths aren't written in manuals but are revealed by terrain to soldiers who possess both the tactical understanding to recognize truth and the courage to act on it even when action violates every rule they've been taught, and that sometimes, not always, not even usually, but sometimes in circumstances that only the soldier on the ground can recognize. The only way to survive is to stand up when everyone else is staying down, to make yourself visible when visibility seems suicidal, to trust that the ground's geometry will prove stronger than the enemy's firepower, and to sustain that trust for 2 hours while machine guns try to prove you wrong. And if you're right, and if you survive, then maybe decades later someone will try to explain what you did and why it worked, but the explanation will never quite capture the simplicity of the insight that put you on that knoll in the first place. That you could see them from up there, that they would reveal themselves shooting at you, that everyone had a better chance if you drew fire, and that sometimes courage is not about ignoring danger but about understanding it completely and choosing exposure anyway because the tactical geometry demands it and the alternative is certain death and standing up is the only option that might work.